Hello everyone, and welcome to a brand new program here on FSU TV3 called the Interfaith Roundtable. I'm Mark Perman, and I serve as the Rabbi of the Jewish congregation in Cumberland, which is called Ber Chaim, which means well of life. Our program will be designed to explore different religions, different religious perspectives from a variety of faiths, to help us better understand these different religions as well as how they speak to some of the problems we are facing in our world today. For me, it's exciting to have a chance to do this program once again, having hosted a program by the same title several years ago. You never saw it, believe me, in a place you probably never heard of called Simsbury, Connecticut. If anybody wants to go there, I can tell you where it is. Anyway, I'll be looking for feedback from our audience as to what you think of our new show and how you feel we can speak more to your interests regarding our different religious faiths, and of course to talk about your faiths and denominations and where you think you might fit in. Religion is a difficult topic for discussion, of course, but it's one we hope to engage in thoughtfully, creatively, honestly, and of course invite your feedback as well. And I'll give you a little bit of that contact information a little bit later. And now on to our guests. Reverend Rebecca Vardaman is a retired ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. She's served churches in Allegheny County for 25 years, and she's only 25 years old. and a chaplain for Western Maryland Health System for 2 years. In retirement, she preaches at various area churches as needed and heads the Cumberland Area Interfaith Ministerium, which we call...
Kaima.
Kaima, okay. She is involved in the Women's Action Coalition here in Allegheny County, and she also is part of a very important group in Allegheny County, which we might talk about as well, called Choose Civility. She's also married to a very fine fellow, and she plays the harp and piano, which maybe you'll come back one day and play both for us. Pastor Perman Svensson is an ordained pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, currently serving as interim pastor of Christ Lutheran Church in LaVale. Pastor Svensson grew up in Norway and came to the Cumberland area in 1988?
86.
See, I can't read anymore because I'm getting old. He had a plumbing and heating business for 20 years, so if you need a plumber or a heating person, call you, ministry. Not right. Before sensing a call to ordain ministry. He also has a Master of Divinity degree from what used to be Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary in Gettysburg, PA, now called the United Lutheran Seminary. He's currently working on his Doctor of Ministry degree through Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, with a focus on congregational mission and leadership. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
This is my first show. You are the guinea pigs.
Thank you.
It feels like that.
Does it? Oh,
It's
okay.
okay.
Well, you know.
That's all right.
Someone has to start, and you're
That's
it.
right.
So tell us and tell our audience a little bit first what propelled you to ministry. I imagine both of you had secular lives or training prior, and then something inspired you or called you to want to do this kind of work. So what was it? Rebecca?
Well, my first career was teaching piano, and but I took a year off in Texas. That's where I'm from, and I took a year off in Baltimore to be part of a Franciscan lay volunteer mission community, to live in community with other people and do mission work in the city, helping out in different places. And I wound up never going back to Texas, never going back to teaching piano, but that kind of set me on a path, and I never felt like I had a vision of the end result, but every step just led to the next. And I finally realized I had a call to seminary. I wasn't sure why, but I wanted to go to seminary. So I went to seminary in DC, and I kept being pulled toward ministry in the church. And so I became ordained.
Can you talk for a moment just about that idea of calling? I mean, I know what it is for me, but a lot of folks may not. I mean, you don't get a call on the telephone. You have a call, like a spiritual...
And I believe everybody has a calling. And I'll get all fancy. Vocare, right? Vocare is the Latin word for calling. No, it's
calling.
not call. But it has to do also with the word vocation. Everybody has a vocation. It may not be necessarily what you do for a living, but what you're called to do in a spiritual way. So I believe everybody has a spiritual calling or vocation. And it may be in your work, but it also may be something else aside from that. So.
Perman?
Yeah, so in the introduction you heard that I was a plumbing guy, and I was in a place in my life where I felt a need to connect with a church, and having grown up in Norway, I had Lutheran background because the population of Norway is predominantly Lutheran. And I actually, my family and I, we ended up at Christ Lutheran in Lavale, where I'm currently serving as interim pastor. And it didn't take very long before I wanted to be part of the ministries of the church. Of course, with a plumbing and heating background, I became very active on the property committee, and there were always
people
plumbing
like you
issues.
are more valuable on the church than
That's an important vocation.
Yeah. So, but really, as years went by, I became part of the leadership. I started to work with youth, accompany youth to youth gatherings, be part of confirmation ministry, leading Bible study, organize mission trips, and it just became part of life, wanting to be part of the ministries of Christian community. And my pastor and I had lunch one day, and I happened to casually mention it to him. Perhaps if I were a little younger, I would consider ministry. And
so you're never too old.
Yeah, so he took me on a field trip to Gettysburg, and that started my journey towards ordained ministry.
So that transition from the secular world to the religious world, first of all, being clergy myself in the Jewish faith, people sort of type us, kind of say, you know, well, they must be religious fanatics or something like that. But if they get to know us, they actually find out we are quote unquote regular people. So was that a difficult transition? People said, what are you getting? You're becoming a fanatic or what? You know?
Yeah, I think it was more how I saw myself. I had never really seen myself as, or thought of myself as clergy material, because in my mind, clergy is, you know, the kind of pastors you see on TV in suit and tie and so forth, and perhaps, you know, being the child of another clergy person. But when I came to seminary, I discovered very quickly pastors come in all kinds of shapes and forms and flavors, which that put my mind at ease.
Many people might not realize clergy can have tattoos too. I mean,
Yep.
you can do, you know,
Yep,
regular things.
sure thing.
Was that hard for you? Did people wonder why, Rebecca, you were doing this now? Like why you were transitioning from, but you started younger, right? You started at a younger age?
Well, it was still second career.
Right.
You know, I was, I'd say about 30.
Right.
And I did grow up in a church family. My father's a minister too. And I never even thought about ministry. And when I first went home and told my parents, I said, I think I'm called to go to seminary. And they said, oh, we're not surprised. I said, well, I'm surprised. You know, you could have given me a hint. But it was something that fit very naturally. When I started going through the ordination process, because I had this music background, one of the questions I had was, well, don't you think you might actually be called to be an organist or a choir director? I was like, no, music's a part of it, but I'm called to word and sacrament.
Let's just remind our viewers that we're talking to Rebecca Vardaman, who is a Methodist minister, retired Methodist minister, and Tormod Svensson, who is currently the minister and pastoral guide at Christ Lutheran Church in Lavale. And you'll be leaving the community, and that's another thing that I find interesting, is that there's that cycling in and cycling out of different clergy, and you move on, and how do you establish those relationships, leave them, and then restart them? That's got to be difficult.
Yeah, so the polity in the different denominations are a little different, I think. And in the Lutheran Church, the call process is really between the synod, which is, a cluster of congregations, and the synodical bishop and the congregation. So the previous pastor was here for 27 years, and I am finding myself to be more of an interim transitional pastor. I think that's where my gifts are. So there are pastors who certainly stay in a setting, in a congregation for a long period of time. I find transitions to be fascinating. So I think with me it's more, I find it exciting, somewhat challenging, but exciting. And transitions, I think, are great opportunities to do something different and perhaps readjust where the direction might need to go for the future.
So whereas some people find that kind of gut-wrenching and fearful and challenging, you see it as sort of a welcome challenge. You see yourself in that role.
Yep.
A lot of time I was an interim cantor at a congregation in Houston, and you sort of come in and help provide the fix. If there's been a lot of conflict, if there's been a lot of drama, God forbid any church should have any drama, right? You kind of come in, soothe, calm, provide a little transitional presence, and then you're gone, which most people understand, but some people might say, why are you leaving, right?
Yeah, it's always hard because, even I've been there for about a year and a half now. And of course you build relationships. And of course, this was my congregation that nurtured me towards ordained ministry. So I already had some relationships. But I made it very clear early on that it was not appropriate for me to stay as the interim pastor. But of course, transitions have hard parts to it too, and leaving such relationships can be hard.
And Rebecca, you've been sort of in one place, you were in one place for a while, right?
I've only served a few churches. I was at Ellerslie, a small church, for 11 years, and then went to the Frostburg United Methodist Church for about 6.5 years, then the hospital. And so I feel like it's been a gift to stay in this community because as a preacher's kid, a PK. PK, preacher's kid.
Okay.
Or as my sister used to say, TO, theological offspring. She thought preacher's kid, PK was too common. But it's been nice to stay in one area and pastor different groups. But I've never lived anywhere this long. So I say, I love going to the Martins, to the, anywhere, because I always see people I know from here or there. Yeah. And I feel like this is home. So,
like local celebrities, right?
No, just local folks.
Right. So tell us a bit, one thing I'd like to educate myself on and the viewers who don't belong to your denominations. Just tell us a little bit about, why Lutheran, what Lutheran is about. I did a little research myself, but I think I'd like to know what propelled you to that particular movement, and for Rebecca to become a Methodist and a Methodist minister.
Yeah. So I think I mentioned it earlier that growing up in Norway, it was very natural to be drawn to the Lutheran denomination because Norway is virtually all Lutheran.
Is it?
Yeah.
Is there a reason for that? I mean, did just Martin Luther caught on there?
Well, sure. So that brings us to perhaps talking a little bit about the denomination itself. Martin Luther was really the one who kicked off the Reformation in Germany in the 16th century. And the movement spread very quickly throughout Northern Europe, Western and Northern Europe in particular. And Norway was, Scandinavia in general was a country that became Lutheran quite early. But the Lutheran tradition in America is somewhat different, I think, than if you think about where it originated and how it is present in today's religious climate. When you say you're Lutheran in America, it can mean a lot of different things. I'm part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is the greatest, the biggest denomination. We have about the biggest Lutheran denomination. We have about 4 million people, 4 million members. But there are also other Lutheran church bodies, such as the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. We have one such congregation here in town.
What's the word?
The Missouri Synod.
Missouri Synod.
Missouri.
Yes.
Oh, Missouri.
Missouri. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
It's a Norwegian accent.
You don't have any.
But there's also there are other Lutheran church bodies. One is called Wisconsin Synod, and we're all Lutheran, but I think it in many ways has to do with are we more or less fundamentalist in our beliefs in how we live things out?
Right. Well, you said that word evangelical, which those of us who don't know it too well but have an impression of it, evangelical implies, for me, out to convert or feeling like this is the way and everybody else doesn't get it. I mean, is that just a false stereotype of that word?
Yeah, it has become, I think, the common view of seeing evangelical that way. It really means the good news, proclaimer of the good news.
The good news, yeah.
So when we think about evangelical in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, I don't think we can necessarily put our views together together with what's commonly seen as evangelical in today's world. It is more the sense of the focus is on proclamation of the good news of Jesus Christ. So it's really about grace in so many ways.
Let's go to Rebecca for a second,
go
just
ahead.
about the Methodist Church. The other tricky question I thought of, and you don't have to answer it if you want, if Jesus came back today, which denomination would he join? I mean, how would he know?
Methodist, of course.
Right, Methodist, of course. No, he'd be Jewish,
Yeah, right, he would.
I mean, would he look at all of this going, wow, did all
He'd be
this
going
come
back
from
home.
me? Yeah, he'd go back home, yeah.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the Methodist.
Well, the Methodist Church began as part of the Reformation, later stages of it. And I think Wesley, who began the Methodist Church in England, like Luther in Germany, I think did not actually intend to start a new denomination. They were reformers. They wanted to make changes to improve things. And Wesley saw the Church of England not reaching out to the poor, not serving in ways that were needed, and so
Not
he
being
was
true to Jesus in a sense.
in a sense, right,
yeah.
right. And so he was just very much taking the good news out to the poor. He would preach outside the mines to people as they were going into work. He would that sort of thing, and it wound up starting a new denomination, even though that wasn't his intent. Then it spread. It came to the U.S. And
Why Methodist?
it was actually kind of a slur. It was a put down because when Wesley and his brother John and his brother Charles Wesley were at Oxford, where they were in school, and their group, their little religious group, were so methodical. I mean, they didn't feel you could waste a moment of your day. You had to be doing God's work all the time.
All the time.
And yeah, they were pretty
Can't watch TV.
intense.
Nothing. Yeah.
right. Wesley said you do not fritter away
Yeah.
any time.
No computer games.
It's just a little too intense actually for today. But to call them Methodists was actually a put down. Oh, they're so methodical. They're Methodist.
So why would the movement have adopted a phrase that was sort of a pejorative?
Why do you do that? I don't know. The name sticks and it becomes something you claim.
Right. Like we
know.
have in Judaism a Yiddish word called goy, which only means outsider, outside the Jewish community, but it's taken on a pejorative when someone's not Jewish. Oh, he's a goy, or he's part of the goyim. It's like not one of us. So suddenly a word that really doesn't mean negative takes on a negative, and you have to be careful.
And this was negative turning into positive in a
Right.
sense, yeah. But yeah, the same thing.
So how do we, as religious leaders, try to affect and influence a world that is so primarily secular? I mean, we have our devoted folks, we have our religious folks. I often find people who say they're spiritual but not religious, which, you know, I can identify with, having come back to this work from somewhat of a spiritual vision or reawakening, whatever you want to call it. How do we do that without getting really frustrated?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, this is, I think, a struggle for most religious bodies today. Christianity is actually still growing, but it's growing in different parts of the world. And I think it is in the Western world that we experience the problems and the decline. I think I mentioned it, that I like transitional ministry, but I also I have a very missional approach to what it might be like anymore to be the church. Because, you know, it used to be a time not that long ago where the church was kind of and the church and the synagogue was at the center of the communities.
Yep.
And people would come. That was where people would gather and so forth. That's no longer the case. So the big question is, how then can we still connect with people spiritually? Because we are all spiritual beings. I believe that. And people are still searching for meaning in life. And I think a more missional approach that I try to at least introduce to the churches that I serve is, let's get out the door. Let's get out the door and build those relationships with people in the community. I think so often the church is seen as hypocritical,
And
judgmental, and
some are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some synagogues,
absolutely.
some Jewish communities.
Yep.
Definitely.
So how do we turn that mindset around, and how we need to look to, at least as a Christian, I feel, what was the way of Jesus? Well, he was out on the margins. He was in touch with people who struggled with life. And perhaps we need to do that. Perhaps we need to get out there and build those relationships, not necessarily to say you need to get back to church so you can feed our organization, but rather to say, where are you? Where are you with God? What are your struggles, and how can we walk with you?
Here's a great phrase, I'm not sure what it is, in one of the Jewish documents or the Talmud or the Mishnah, that someone says, God, where are you? And the response back from God is, well, where are you?
Yeah.
You know, where are you in terms of your relationship to me, and so forth. So, thoughts about that, Rebecca?
Well, Methodists have the same challenges. You know, the church becomes more of a club where you go to be with people that are like you, that, you know, you might...
Play Mahjong. Bingo.
Mahjong, what's that? Right. But you get together for your social events and your worship and all that. And I wonder what Jesus would say. And the thing about many churches is all churches think they are warm and friendly and welcoming because they have that feeling generally with the people that are there, the people they know.
Right.
But when someone walks in the door of that place for the first time, it can feel entirely different. Entirely different. And the Methodist Church came up with a great, really kind of promotional slogan, probably about 10 or 12 years ago or longer. Open hearts, open minds, open doors. Trying to describe who we are and then trying to sort of live into that. In the meantime, we're struggling with, who do we actually welcome? Who are we comfortable with having sitting in the pew next to us or standing up there preaching and leading worship? And it's, you know, with younger generation, folks that are looking for places that are more welcoming and open, and that the churches and probably all religious groups are kind of struggling to be that really welcoming and looking to the future place.
We've had those real declines here in Allegheny County. What's that big church, Center Street Church, that's closed? I hear churches are merging, synagogues are merging. In Long Island, especially other communities.
Some of the Catholic churches in the area are.
So the other one theory is that the young people, I used to say yuppies, they're not yuppies anymore, the millennials, whatever, they don't really join things. They have their computer, they have their internet, they shop online, so they don't feel the need to join a community like that. You know, unless they're preparing kids for, in our world, a bar mitzvah, or in your world, maybe confirmation or something. So are we really sort of done with sort of that organized structure, the church, the edifice, and it's going to pretty soon be in people's homes? You know what I mean?
Well, and that's where the church started, isn't it? In homes, small groups.
Yeah, and I think there's, you know, you mentioned millennials. Millennials in general have a little different mindset. They don't care for you know, organizations, organized religion, or organized anything. It's the institution that they really do not like or care for. I know millennials who are very religious and looking for, you know, something that's going to give them meaning, a part of being whatever that community looks like. There are even movements within Lutheran Church that do dinner church. Okay.
If you give them food, they will come.
Yeah. So, but yet there are also millennials who really much appreciate the more traditional sense of worship style. But I think there are a few things, there are a few common denominators, such as they do not like hypocrisy. They do not like judgment.
Does anyone really like hypocrisy?
No.
Or, you know, people have gotten used to it?
We don't like it from other people, but we don't realize when we're
When
being
we
the
are
hypocrite of the judgment.
Yeah, and of course, I think one of the hot buttons right now has to do with sexuality and gender identities and so forth. And I mean, there are branches of the Christian church that are very anti-gay and anti all that. And I think that gives a bad taste in the mouth of our younger friends.
Even if they find a religious basis for it and say, you know, I'm sorry, but here's what it says. Boom, 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 Leviticus, da-da-da-da-da. It's not about my personal view. I might be personally open to anything, but if I'm going to be an authentic Christian, I have to go by boom, boom, boom. And then, you know,
But there are different ways to be an authentic Christian.
Right.
And that because there are different ways to interpret and understand Scripture, and it's probably the same, you know, in your
no
faith
kidding.
as well.
Yeah.
You can be very literal and say God said it and I believe it, kind of thing, or you can do more interpreting and putting in context and that sort of thing. But that literal position is really tough because if you're going to take this passage here literally, well, does that mean we should be taking the next chapter literally, which talks about divorce or that, you know, that sort of thing. And this sort of picking and choosing is called proof texting.
Proof texting
is the technical name for that. But where we say this part we take literally and this part we feel is so important, and I'm talking United Methodist Church here, that we will break our church apart over this. You know,
And some of them have split.
And we very well could be headed toward a
Where was
division of our denomination.
Didn't you go to a conference where there was a real deep split? Was that you?
I didn't go to it, but just recently, earlier this year, you know, there was a big, especially our church meets every 4 years, and this is our global United Methodist Church. And like Tormod was saying, the areas where it's growing is primarily, I think, the Philippines and Africa. And those also are very conservative areas as well. So put together with our more conservative regions, like the southeast of our country, that's a very large part. The United Methodist Church has, there once was a saying, there's a United Methodist Church in every zip code in the nation. And supposedly we were one of the most representative kind of churches where, you know, there's Methodist of all kinds in all regions. And I was brought up believing that you can be a United Methodist and worship together, learn together, serve together, and you don't have to agree on every issue. You can still be the church together.
Right.
and trust God to handle the rest. But now we're much more like our political thing, where I want to be with people that are like me, and we want to be, and we can't come together.
A lot of divisions. Talk a bit if the difference between religion and spirituality. A lot of people misunderstand the two. They think you can have one without the other, which you can. I personally think it's better if the two go together, but that's me. But let people know from your perspective, what's the distinction between the two?
Yeah. Well, I think every person can be, anyone can be spiritual per se. I mean, there are probably all kinds of definitions of spiritual. But when I think about being spiritual, what comes to mind is that my understanding is that there is something greater than us, okay? There is a higher power, if you will. And how can I connect with that higher power and so forth. Religion, I think, often becomes more of an organized, organized branch of religion, if you will, whether it's Hinduism or Judaism or Islam or Christianity. And it becomes, sometimes being religious can even come across as having a little bit of a bad flavor to it, because you're almost part of this sect, if you like, or and you have to conform because that's the identity of that particular organization. And again, that doesn't always fare well with our millennials, I think, because and I think you touched on this a little bit, if you don't mind. What do people perceive and like might be one thing. What Scripture might say, as where we as religious people are coming from, may not necessarily match. But then again, how do you read Scripture? And today I see there's such a division between fundamentalist and liberal when it comes to religious views across the board. And there's something to be said for that, I think, because fundamentalism, it goes across religious borders. It just does. It just does.
We have it in the Jewish world too.
So, to me, it's more, if I want to call myself a Christian, and I can't really speak for the Jewish faith, but if I want to call myself a Christian, I need to read everything in Scripture through the lens of Jesus.
Right.
And in the Christian faith, at least to me, the most important commandment is to love God and love neighbor.
To love thy neighbor as thyself.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if we do that faithfully, all this other stuff kind of tends to fall in place.
Right? Rebecca, spirituality, religion?
Well, I think often religion becomes the things we do, our worship, our Bible study, but is it spiritual or not? To me, that is the question of, is it changing us? Going through the motions, showing up in church every Sunday, or going to that Bible study every week, that's religion. But spirituality is, are you being changed by that? Is God, are you listening to God? Are you being guided in your life, your vocation again, your what God really could be calling you to do in your life.
So in a modern world of technology and all these great innovations, I don't want to say people worship technology, but they feel like we are enlightened, we are scientifically sophisticated people, we have our technology, therefore we don't really, God is sort of an ancient concept, it's nice, it makes us feel good, but it's not a reality in the world. If you want to believe it, it's fine. We tend to focus on human achievements. How do you counter that, not necessarily atheistic, but agnostic point of view? When you reference God, most people are going, oh yeah, God again. You know what I mean? How do you filter that into people's lives? I'm struggling with it.
You know, that's kind of that's sort of the science mind versus the religious mind, I think.
Right.
And they have been really separate, and I'm not a scientist, and I can't explain.
But you play the harp.
But
and the harp is science of music. You know?
It could be, yeah, all right. But I think there are things that are being discovered in science that I wish I had a better handle on. But I know I've read bits and pieces that we're discovering that there's more than we see, more than we understand. I mean, for instance, this table, which appears very solid and hard, is I almost want to say alive. That sounds silly, but it is made up of things we cannot see, and there's energy in this table that's holding it together. It starts to sound very new agey or weird, but it's science, and there's more that science is showing us, that there is something below just the concrete and the observable and the measurable. And I think science is finding its way back to not God, a big old man up in the clouds, you know, that throws thunderbolts at you if he doesn't like you. But the source of all life, of all creation, which I believe is God.
Yeah. There's a great Hasidic tale. The Hasidim are sort of the spiritual innovators for Judaism starting in the 18th century. And there's a famous story of a Hasidic Rabbi, and someone says, do you really believe in God? Do you believe in God? And he bangs the table. Hope that doesn't break it. And he says, this is a table. I don't have to believe it. It's a table. Same thing with God. You know, it just is.
And God is that hard and solid.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's funny you use that example.
Yeah. So sometimes I get in conversation with people who say they do not believe in God. And if I'm able to get some kind of relationship going to where they can trust me enough to speak a little bit more about that, I often find it's based on bad experiences previously in life.
Why did things happen to me?
Yeah. Well, also even the church sometimes can be part of having given them a bad experience.
I've heard that.
I've been hurt by the church. I have been, shunned by the church because all of a sudden I find myself as a single mom, or I have been shunned by the church because my son came out as gay. So
Or some abuse cases too.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, but I wonder sometimes too, if you have been hurt by the religious organization that you had trust in, what does that do to you and your openness to even find a spiritual connection? And I see people seeking then other stuff, whether it's drugs or technology or whatever it is, because it's all out there in the world, and we're still seeking, and that's the place people go seeking.
Yeah, as we're winding down, that's a question I just want to speak to for a moment, is this belief that perhaps people falling into drugs or heroin, opioid, really it's a sense of self-medicating. I think we can all understand that, but if we could infuse people with a sense of spirituality and a higher and deeper experience of life before they turn to that, could that be a better, sincere, could it be a palatable option for them that keeps them from going the destructive route, or is that Pollyannish?
No, I think that's definitely true.
So how do we get that message to them? Yeah.
Well, for one thing, I mean, I think a lot of turning to drugs, and in our community, we have a lot of poverty. We're in Appalachia, and there's a sense of hopelessness in people often. Sometimes with good reason, sometimes it's things they've done themselves, decisions, but it's a lot that's been that they just have, it's the world they exist in.
Right.
And I think a lot of that is searching for something, and I agree, but part of the trying to give them something good is giving them meaning in their lives, helping with job opportunities, education opportunities, family, child raising opportunities, to try to I think you have to come at it from a spiritual side and also from a very practical side.
Yeah, like
To help,
Jesus would
to
go
make a
out
difference.
he'd do the field work. He would go
Yeah.
out there, right, and talk
Right.
to just put himself out there. And it's very easy to stay behind the ivory tower or stay where we're comfortable. But is that something we need to do, is really go out there the way Jesus did and do that sort of field ministry to the poor and the struggling?
Yeah, and I think also tying in with that, well, a lot of times churches are really good at feeding people or giving them something, like kind of a top-down approach, the poor versus us, right? What happens when you get out there on the fringes and you actually get to know people and build those relationships? You learn something. You learn that the stories, there are reasons often why people ended up where they are. And just having that sense of compassion, you are another human being regardless of where you are in life, whether you have become addicted or poor or homeless or any of that, you're still a valuable human being. And I want to hear your story so I can walk with you. And what does that look like? And I think that's where the church need to be, or we as people of faith, whatever that may look like, because we are all human beings trying to figure out what this thing is called life is all about.
And by the time we finish or figure it out, it's probably too late to do anything about it. It's like, we need a second. I'm sure the college kids have it all figured out. Maybe they can explain it to us. So, as we wind down, any other final thoughts you'd like to share? Maybe I was thinking of a retired ministry versus when you were, doing it full-time or part-time. Does it now open up opportunities for you, to maybe rethink the way people should perceive retirement? It's not just put your feet up.
Almost everybody who says something about their retirement says, I'm busier than I was before, or how did I get done, all the things that I used to get done, because now the day just fills up.
Right.
And I'm enjoying being in different churches, many of them Lutheran. I told Perman, I said, I feel almost more Lutheran than Methodist these days because I'm serving and here and there at different times.
How does that work if they say, what do you know?
We are in full communion, which means that the Methodist, United Methodist and Lutherans are able to preach and also offer the sacraments in each other's churches. So that works out real well.
Like me, who don't really know what being Jewish, just can you 30 seconds on what that is, the sacraments?
Well, we have the primary. Okay, Methodists have only two sacraments. United Methodists have the sacrament of Holy Communion and the sacrament of baptism, okay? And other denominations, I think, have those, but also have some others as well. But when specific denominations come to full agreement up in their upper levels, our sort of the administrative side of our church, then we can offer those sacraments in each other's churches. It's,
Interesting.
Just just very briefly, Lutherans also only have two sacraments. That was one of the rubbing points with Martin Luther, actually. Kind of defining sacraments in the Lutheran Church are two things. It would have to have been initiated by Jesus, and it has to include an earthly element, such as baptism is water, and with communion we have bread and wine.
Well, we really are the same in that.
Yeah.
How do we know, it's hard for Jews to know exactly what God wants from us. We have the Torah, we have the Talmud, we have all these different commentaries. We sort of have a sense of what Moses and the emissaries were expecting of us in terms of action and conduct and behavior. Is it possible to know, with a lot of the wisdom filtered in through generations, Paul came 100 years after Jesus, is it hard to know, can you decipher what Jesus himself would have said and wanted versus what everything that was said in his name going forward? Can you kind of root out what you think he meant versus what so-and-so might have said he meant? Or is that sort of impossible?
I think it is. You know, again, it has to do with how do we read Scripture. And you're right, the Gospels were written perhaps 60 through maybe as late as 100 AD, depending on the Gospels. And Paul's letters were probably about 60. So we need to understand, I think, a little bit what kind of context were these words written, and by whom, and for whom, right? So with me, I think it is, again, let's look at the overall picture here. Who was this character, Jesus? What of God is reflected in his life, death, and resurrection? And to me, it boils down to it's about love. It's about a loving God loving us. So therefore, we are called to also love others. What does that look like? And I mean, also just very quickly, I think spiritual discernment is important. In other words, how do we listen to God, right? Where do we hear God's voice, and how do we know? And to me, it's about, sometimes you need to take time and listen. Sometimes God's voice, the Spirit is very present in the voice of others around me. And I need to decipher then, does this fit with, is it a loving thing? Is this something that Jesus would have, you know, encouraged?
And Martin Buber, a famous Jewish theologian, said, you have the I, thou. You, I, thou, that's how you see God in terms of your relationship to other people. When you enter into that relationship, that's where you find God.
Yeah. And that's what we need the community for too, like you're saying, is, you know, we can all go on a kind of crazy tangent and say, well, God is calling me to go and open this shoe store. You know, or get strange ideas from God, but the community is where we interact and find that vision together.
Or the people who say, God told me to go in and shoot, you know, to do
right.
those things. I mean,
really,
people who are
really
schizophrenic or have other.
Yeah,
so,
but the community has a greater wisdom.
Thank you, Reverend Rebecca Vardaman, Pastor Perman Svensson. I'm sorry to go right in front of you. We hope you enjoyed this first edition of the Interfaith Roundtable. I do want to thank our professors and directors back there, Professor John Lombardi and his wife Melanie. Thank you so much for giving me and our community this opportunity to express ourselves about different theology and religions and how they intersect and interact with a complicated and struggling world. I'm Rabbi Cantor Mark Perman of Ber Chaim Congregation, Cumberland, and you're watching FSU TV3. Thank you.